Hello and welcome to another Ancient Warfare magazine podcast. My name is Jasper Oorthuis. I'm the editor of the magazine, and I'm joined here today with Murray Dam, Mark DeSantis, Mike Cole, Lindsay Powell, and Mark McCaffrey. And today we're going to discuss the theme of Ancient Warfare issue 14.2, which is the rise of the Legion, a very early history of the Roman army. And we've got a bunch of questions here that we can probably discuss for several hours, but we have to keep it within a sort of reasonable limit. Don't want to cause any ears to bleed. And I think we're going to start off with a question that is near and dear, very close to the theme of the issue. And that is a question from Brian on Patreon. Was the early Roman military evolution to a phalanx caused by direct contact with the Greeks or the Etruscans? Who wants to? There's a whole bunch of suppositions in that question that we can talk about. Anybody want to kick that off?
Well, Livy certainly believed that the Romans fought as in a phalanx because the Etruscans made them do it. They adopted the phalanx weaponry. The exact nature of how the Romans went from whatever the war bands were that they had during their earliest period of clan or tribal warriors and how they actually adopted the phalanx is probably more complicated than simply saying they adopted it wholesale from the Etruscans. Certainly the Etruscans were an enormous cultural and thus military organizational influence on the Romans. The early Romans would also have had contact with the Greeks of southern Italy who fought in the phalanx. One of the things that probably distinguished the Roman phalanx, or whatever you would call that phalanx-ish organization that they had, was that it likely retained archaic features of the earliest Greek phalanx and wouldn't have looked precisely the way the Greek phalanx looked as we know it from the time of the Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian War. To wit, presumably the Romans, as they organized their warriors, or at least they inducted them according to wealth classifications. They classified them according to wealth, actually. I believe that the Roman phalanx probably had men of varying types of equipment fighting in the phalanx alongside each other. That is, you would have had someone who would have resembled something like the true or classic hoplite, who was fighting also alongside perhaps someone who just had a shield and a spear and a helmet. Maybe someone had a shield and a spear. The wealth of the warriors was probably simply that. It differentiated the warriors, but it did not mean that they couldn't fight in the phalanx directly if they were not equipped with the full hoplite panoply as we would know it from the Greek phalanx.
To argue against that. Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, to put a different spin on that, a lot of modern scholarship is actually now questioning the idea of there being a phalanx in the first place, in terms of the Roman army. In terms of, on the one hand, you might say, isn't there evidence in terms of the archaeological record or in terms of artistic motifs that show a phalanx or the aspis shield, of course, of the Greeks? But of course, does that actually necessarily lead to there being a phalanx in terms of the Roman military? I mean, on the one hand, you can have them picking up aspects of the military equipment from the Greeks and using them in a different way. So, of course, going from what might be described as the war bands of early Roman history, they might be picking up military equipment from the Greeks that hoplites would use, but actually using it in a totally different way in the early period. You've also got to consider that all this information, like what's just been mentioned in terms of Livy and Dionysius Halicarnassus, they're writing in the 1st century BC. And of course, how good their sources are is questionable that they're working with. Are they trying to fill the gaps in an area that they're not sure of? And of course, one suggestion has been that they're trying to fill the gaps by where they don't know about the equipment being used in Rome or in central Italy. They're turning for an alternative to the Greek sources, which are much better in terms of the military equipment of the period. And so therefore, we get this sort of Greek makeshift history of Roman military equipment. It's another view.
The three scholars that... Sorry, Murray, go ahead.
You go, Mike. No,
so the three scholars that are most advancing, that I just want to give listeners some reading prompts if they're interested in looking at the work of those modern scholars who are debunking this idea of there having been a phalanx. And it's Roel Clinendijk, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. He used to be with Leiden University. He's just moved to a new place now. It's Owen van der Wees, I think is his name, and Joshua Brouwers. And I believe Dr. Joshua Brouwers is a writer for another Koransore publication, Ancient History. I know that Owen has a column called Bad Ancient, which is really dedicated to debunking myths in ancient scholarship and in ancient warfare. But these, I would say, are the three big voices that if you want to hear or read about articles that are debunking the idea of a phalanx. There's also there's one thing I keep seeing coming up again and again, which is it's from the poetry of Tyrtaeus, which is both the best argument for a phalanx and against it. But he talks about light armed infantry taking shelter behind hoplites, which of course is extremely difficult to do in a tightly packed phalanx of 8 ranks. How are you going to have skirmishers tucked in there? Is one of the things I hear brought up all the time. And there's one other point that I don't see in the scholarship, which I really think speaks to what Mark is just saying, which is the idea that it's very, very easy. When you think about what a phalanx is, it really is just a line of men standing shoulder to shoulder with their shields and their weapons. That's all it is. And it is very, very easy that's a natural way to form up when you're in a group of people and you're trying to avoid being flanked. So really, like, is it a war band? Is it a phalanx? Like, I could very, very easily see those terms being transposed in the sourcing. Of course, these three scholars I've mentioned do a lot better job of picking those literary sources apart more directly.
I mean, we were very lucky in the issue because we had Jeremy Armstrong from Auckland. We also had Michael Taylor and Josh Hall, all right, and they are also on those on the forefront of the debate about what is the actual origins of Roman warfare and the Roman phalanx that it exists, and they actually are on different positions. So some say no, some say yes, some are trying to be a synergy of the evidence. And I think, like Mark McCaffrey was saying, the interesting thing is that the modern scholarship is arguing, no, it wasn't a phalanx, because, as you say, Mike, it's men standing in a row, but was it a Greek phalanx? And I think there is part of it is, there is a, if it quacks like a duck theory, which is you have Etruscan and then later Roman hoplites, because they are wearing a cuirass or a linothorax or tube and yoke armor. They are using what looks like an Argive shield. They have helmets that look the same. They have spears that look the same. They're wearing greaves. They look like a hoplite. They stand in ranks. Therefore, they're hoplites. And therefore, the Romans and the Etruscans have a phalanx. And I think that is very hard to argue against, except, as one of the articles in the issue makes the point, the manipular development and even the Triple Aces development, which is more flexible, can't come out of a phalanx, which by definition is actually inflexible. You can't develop a flexible system out of an inflexible system. It's got to be a revolution of some sorts to go, actually, this inflexible system isn't working for us. Let's come up with a flexible system. And so the argument is, actually, the Roman phalanx was never a phalanx. It was actually always relatively flexible, which, as you were saying, Mike, was about, the distances between men being greater. There's, we do have the leves and then the later velites who can go back back through the ranks, and even in Greek battles, it's like, well, where do the light armed go? Are they just stuck there? They must be able to retreat through the ranks at some point. So it's a very interesting argument that you've got evidence on one side saying it's a phalanx, and then you've got evidence saying no, it wasn't. It's a cultural appropriation of Greek literature to rewrite Roman literature because we don't know. And again, we're very picky and choosy about that. When we're told by Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus that the Roman legionaries carried spears that they used in two hands, and that Livy saying that the Roman phalanx was a Macedonian phalanx, we kind of go, no, they're wrong. But if it's a Greek phalanx, like a hoplite phalanx, it's okay. It's acceptable to say that, but not to go one step too far and call it Macedonian. So there's a very interesting bias on our part when it comes to the evidence that we're willing to accept or reject. The interesting thing is that you then have the pendulum swing saying, no, it's completely not a phalanx. And now, as in all debates, there's the pendulum swinging back again, saying, actually, now that you've rejected it, when we look at it, it's actually is a phalanx again. So you get the pendulum swinging both ways in the debate, some saying that's not, some saying that it is. And eventually you'll end up in the middle ground, and there'll be scholars who just refuse to ever agree with one another. That's just the way. There you go. The history of scholarship.
I think the real question in the end is how did they end up with the maniple type army? And the points that are being made in the issue, which I think it gives an interesting, although it's a pretty meaty academically overview of the 2 points that are being made. Is that one is that Michael Taylor argues look at some of the developments that are happening in Greece, where you can see the phalanx becoming more flexible or needing to deal with a more flexible situation, and they're finding solutions there, sometimes in specialist troops. And in Italy, the phalanx becomes itself more flexible, which is borne out, among other things, for instance, by constantly having missile troops in the army itself. Everybody is sort of their own medium infantry, not just like light infantry and heavy infantry, and if you can speak in those terms anyway. And Armstrong, on the other hand, is saying, no, look, what you have, especially in central Italy, is these mini war bands that are clustered around aristocrats of some kind.
Aristoi, yeah.
And they stay always little clusters, and those clusters just sort of grow into the centuries that make up the maniple. The handfuls of men, literally. But
it does sound much more appealing, that second option, really, when you sort of think back. I mean, even though we're sort of questioning our sources and saying, can we trust them? How much can we trust them in terms of the early period and whatnot? If you look at some of the stories that come through, like Coriolanus, and also look at the Tarquins and whatnot, and the Claudii, who all seem to be aristocrats who sort of chop and change from one city to another, and they seem to take their following with them. There seems to be that that propensity for clan politics and clans to actually be establishing their own little fiefdoms, which would make sense that would evolve gradually into the maniple system, a way of bringing together disparate militias, if you like.
And to that point, I wonder whether what you have is a reflection of Roman society. I mean, it's very much a client-patron arrangement. So strongman has his following, as you rightly point out.
Mike?
I think that militaries in general, I think this is sort of a universal truth, is that you see a leapfrogging of attack and defense, that modes of combat evolve in reaction to threats and in concert with threats. And one of the things that I'm very fixated on, and I probably am not the only one, is the loss at the Alia, which I think is 390 BC, when the Senones just run over the legion and they hit Rome. And I see that event as having left a kind of cultural trauma on the Romans, almost like the equivalent of 9/11 for Americans. Like, you cannot look at the American military. You can look at the American military and American policing and American culture in general, and you can see 9/11 happen, and you can see how we fight, how we think about the battle space. And I say this as someone who served, right after it. Like, it's just not my father's military anymore, and it really is part of like this kind of cultural trauma. And I keep thinking that the Alia was that for Rome. And you see all of these things, and this, of course, presumes coming from, an aspis, the oblong shape of the scutum, the reinforced iron bands on the top and bottom, potentially as reactions to the long downward slashing strokes of Celtic swords. You see the Montefortino helmet, which is a Celtic pattern in origin. You just sort of see what I perceive to be a cultural traumatic experience, and then an attempt to react to that feels true to me because I see it in modern militaries. This is going to be totally seem off topic, but like the Meiji reaction to Perry opening Japan. Oh my God, we must imitate the West. Look what happened to us. And so like we talk about natural evolution, but I think it's really interesting to consider that idea of like a cultural traumatic event that causes a revolutionizing influence in the military.
You've said a fabulous word that I was going to bring up in response to Lindsay's point. One of the things we've got in our literary sources is this idea of reformers, the Servian reforms, the Camillan reforms, the Marian reforms later. And literarily, what we have in all of these ideas of descriptions of change in Roman organization is revolution, that this one person is responsible for a complete change in the way we think about war. And I think, like Lindsay was just saying, in the late Roman Empire, in the late Roman Republic, there are still bands of clients who arm themselves when their patron asks them to. That's very, very similar to the Fabii and very early Roman aristocratic war bands. And so there's a continuity there, which, if you look at the development of Roman warfare, we would never say that there's that kind of continuity. We would argue that no, there's a complete change here where we go from phalanx to 3 lines. There's a complete change here where we go from that to maniple. There's a complete change here where we introduce the Marian mule. And I think the funny thing about that is that those events of cultural shock tend to evolve, whether it be rapidly or whether they push forward ideas that had been sort of nebulous until that time. And so it's a long-term evolution rather than a revolutionary change brought about by one person's reforms. But in literature, it's much easier to say all of these things happened under this one person, because that encapsulates it, pigeonholes it, it gives it a title and a set period. Whereas evolution over time, especially for a historian who might be contemporary, is very hard for them to actually notice that these changes have been happening organically or like a wave rather than as a single moment in time.
Well, you're talking about a change over time, but in terms of that change, I think we've sort of mentioned in previous podcasts about the change from maniple to legionary being a bit of a blurry area in terms of saying, well, actually, maybe it was more, perhaps down to individual commanders, and actually we can interpret that, like you were just saying, as individual head of clans leading their armies in their own select way. If that fits.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a very interesting to try and model this innovation is actually fascinating. The trouble is our sources are so thin, so we're almost left with supposition and extrapolation, but the theories are very good.
Yeah. And I think the problem is the historian can't say, well, this guy was doing this, but this guy's kept to the old version, and this guy was doing that, and that guy was doing that, because that doesn't make a clear picture. And again, like before, when Livy says that who is it? I think it's the tree. Who is it that carries the spear with 2 hands? I think it's the Triarius, which is like, whoa, no, we're just going to ignore that. That's not right. That can't possibly have happened. And so we do the same thing. We go, well, we're going to ignore that. That's a bad source. Poor old Diodorus Siculus. Whereas there are historians who we trust, and even Livy, often we have to trust because there's no one else. And so we've got all these caveats, but he's all we've got to go on. So we're in a real problem with that idea that is it an evolution that's actually much more
you can
blurred.
I think that point is actually also made. You can also see parallels later on, like the introduction of the cohort. We have indications that was it Scipio? Is it one of the first to use a cohort-like structure in 210?
Yep.
And then there's some examples in the 2nd century BC, and then everybody sort of goes, yeah, but Marius introduces the cohort at the end of the 2nd century BC, on the cusp of the 1st century. So it's a similar thing. It's like, is there an evolution going on here, or are we pinning it to one guy?
You can also do a parallel with Gladius as well. So switching to the weaponry in terms of, we always you read all the books and you say, okay, the Gladius starts out as a long sword. Early in the Republic, it gradually gets shorter until you get to Augustan times, when it reaches its shortest point, and then into the Imperial period, it gets longer again. But of course, all the way along, you start finding that actually there's exceptions to the rule all the way along, and then all of a sudden it's like, actually, we're looking at a very small percentage to actually establish those rules. But actually,
and we inevitably sort of think in the Mark I Gladius, Mark II Gladius, Mark IIIA.
But I think there's merit in Mike's idea, which is to say that you can have a trauma, and people respond to the trauma, and it may not be the every event of change is a trauma, but there may be significant ones. The trouble is we don't know what they are, because, as Murray's eloquently said, the sources are so thin.
If I could make an observation about whatever you want to call that formation that the Romans had, whether it was a phalanx-ish, a group of war bands or something that became maniples, I think that we went from whatever that was in around the time of the Battle of the Allia to later on having 3 lines of Roman soldiers arrayed to face the enemy. I think that the benefit of those 3 lines, that was something very important, because the idea of a reserve, a subtracted reserve among ancient generals, was not something that was ordinarily, or something that every army had. Whereas the Romans built up a reserve, they built in a reserve to their initial formation. And I think that probably had something to do with what it was like to encounter the Gauls, who were charging madly at the Romans and just overwhelmed the Roman army at the Allia and put it to flight. Whereas I think with 3 lines, if the first line collapses and panics, the 2 lines behind it are not involved in that collapse. That is, in a Greek style phalanx, if part of that line fails, the whole phalanx ultimately fails. Whereas with the 3 lines that the Romans had, the triplex aces, the first one could either flee, or at least, if it was really hard pressed, retire behind the second one to reform. I think that was very important, and that was one of the reasons why the Manipular Legion, meaning the legion is described by Livy from around the time of the Battle of Vesaris in 340 BC, was such a crucial innovation. That is, it had staying power that whatever the Roman phalanx that was at Allia didn't display.
Yeah, hence the expression, the battle came to the Triarii, which is a sign of disaster.
That is tattooed on my chest.
Yeah. Sure.
Is it really?
Yeah. It's, I mean, I'm not going to gross anybody out.
But again,
fortunately, this is a podcast, not a visual video.
But hey, three side notes.
You'll have
three
to
small
imagine.
notes.
Have to imagine Mike's chest.
Three small notes to Mark's first, to Mark's point about the lengthening and shortening and lengthening of the gladius. In an army where people are supplying their own equipment, and this is something we have talked about on this podcast endlessly, having to break this habit of projecting uniformity on ancient armies. If you show up for your, avocados, and your sword is too long, like, you're not going to be sent home, right? This is what's around the house. Like, this is what your father passed down to you. They're not, and I've never seen any kind of, conscription diagram or whatever. I mean, a hemithoracian is mentioned in Philip V's, but like at no point does it say your sword has to be this long, right? You show up with a sword, that's good enough, right? I would guess. So you're going to see, we as scholars later on, we want to project taxonomy, we want to project ontology, we want to create uniformity because we like, as modern people, to organize things in our own mind. And I think Mark's point is that that's kind of a slippery slope and it can create a false impression. Two other notes I wanted to say really quick. Jasper earlier was describing these Aristoi-led war bands. Ancient Warfare, Volume 6, Issue 1, which is From Heroes to Hoplites, is, in my opinion, a really, really great primer for listeners. If you want to get up to speed on what those warbands might have looked like, how they formed, see some great illustrations of them. Ancient Warfare 6.1 is the issue to go to. And then I wanted to correct something. I said Owen Vanderwees. His name is Owen Rees. Owen Rees is the modern scholar, one of those three that I mentioned earlier. I just wanted to make sure I didn't let that go incorrect.
You've blended Hans Van Wees and
yes,
Owen
sorry,
Rees
Owen
together
Rees,
into one
R-E-E-S,
which would,
yes, yeah.
you know.
Sorry about
So there's
that.
there's.
I envision.
I was going to make the point to sorry. I was going to reply to your point, Mark, about the three lines that again in the issue Michael Taylor makes the point that the three lines might have actually come from Greek warfare around the same time at the Battle of Lechaim, where you have the Spartans pursuing the Athenians in age groups. So the youngest are sent first, then the second age group. So there is a three-line sort of precedent in Greek warfare, which may have spilt across into Roman warfare. And again, you've got that issue that they're one of the problems of the literary sources is that the great theses of Roman politics tend to mirror what's going on in Greek politics and Greek literature. And so there's a real issue there of is it a literary invention rather than a real thing? So, the Camillan reforms versus the Cleistheanic reforms at Athens and things like that they're often parallels.
I wanted to build upon the question of retrojecting our own ideas about uniformity of military equipment into the ancient past. That is, it was not like the U.S. Army in World War II where the helmets were the same and the rifles were the same and what have you. It wasn't like that among the Romans. I envision the Roman militia army. And if you think about what it might have been like among the Romans with the so-called Servian army of about 500 BC, somewhere around there, that a militia showing up would have been a lot like the militia of the early United States Republic. That is, different people were being called up with different kinds of equipment. Maybe everyone had a musket of some sort or possibly a rifle, but not everybody had, standardized equipment in any other way. That it was a motley appearance. And depending on, no one was going to be sent home because you had a spear and a shield, but no helmet, or you had a helmet and maybe no spear, no greaves. I think people fought with what they had, and that probably what it echoes is that there's the classification in terms of wealth of the Servian army, as described by Livy. Where each of the various wealth categories have either more or less complete equipment, probably reflected not so much, to my mind, whether or not you would have fought in the battle line. I'll use the word battle line, but rather it simply was a classification of how well equipped you were, or were you relatively poorly equipped, but you were all part of the army. And I think that was probably what we see there, that it was not meant to be taken in a question of this is where you stand in the formation. It was simply more of an organizational thing.
Well, I mean, but both Polybius and Livy, remember, it isn't just the equipment, right? It's the degree of experience and age that Polybius mentions. I mean, I go to Polybius because Livy is, I think most of us agree that Livy is working from Polybius, right?
That's certainly that point, yeah.
I always refer to that legion as the Polybian legion for that reason.
Right. Seems like my prediction from the beginning is going to come true because we've been at it nearly half an hour and we've only done one question. So maybe unsubtly try to get people on the. Well, actually, we can sort of segue, because there's one question about the gladius, and that is, were there any differences in how the gladius was used in the early legions compared with later ones, and how does this weapon evolve? It's maybe a little past the point of this issue, but we've been talking a lot about weapons. Who wants to deal with that one?
So I think there seems to be a consensus, which I think is not adequately supported in modern scholarship, that Romans preferred to thrust with the gladius, right? That thrusting creates a more deadly wound. And near as I can tell, that the sort of source that most people are leading on is Vegetius, writing way after the initial deployment of that weapon. I also think that there seems to be an imposition of uniformity of use and consistency of training, that for this early, especially in a militia army, the later you get in the legion, but the topic of this podcast is the beginning of the legion. The later you get in the legion, like the first real examples of the kind of regular training that I would expect of a later Roman legion, we see that under Philip II, right? And maybe to a somewhat extent under the Thebans earlier than that, although Roll would knock me out for making that argument. He's gone after me about it before. The only reason that's why it's fresh in my mind, I've been looking at it based on his criticism of the idea. But when you're talking about a militia army, and you're talking about people that, are not drilled and professional soldiers, is there a uniform use for something like this? I think that's a fair question to ask.
If I come back to the first point you were making about this whole idea of the gladius being predominantly a thrusting weapon, I think there's a case to be made that that's perhaps tied into some of the ideas that are put around by historians like Livy when they're talking about some of the enemies of Rome, especially the Gauls and Germanic tribesmen, who you mentioned before, supposedly have this tendency to be using larger weapons that they're going to actually come down on their enemies with a big, great swinging action, and the Roman legionaries going up under their arms, using the scutum to sort of buttress what's coming down to actually get under them and actually attack into the thorax and whatnot. It seems to be a little bit of a myth, really, exaggerated by the Romans. And I think we've been taken in.
So speaking as a reenactor, Erm Street Guard, later period I know, but I think to single out the gladius and not to understand the shield is not to get the combat doctrine. So the two work together, and I think that's important, because the way that the shield is designed, which is basically not just to take blows, but it's also actually an offensive weapon. You can actually punch with it. You can actually, by changing its angle, and as Mike pointed earlier, sometimes the edging might be metal, but sometimes they may not be. But the point is, an edge of wood is a nasty weapon if you thrust it in somebody's face. So the point is, you actually have two offensive weapons used together, punching and stabbing. You become like a pugilist, and you can do this in formation, and you're marching forward. It's quite a formidable thing. So if a man's just going to fight with a sword, he's already down by 50%.
It gives him many more options, really.
It really does.
Rather than that, he's going in to stab. And of course, if we go to the column of Trajan, of course, it provides some great examples of legionaries going in with all sorts of moves of attack.
Yeah, and it's very interesting, because we're talking at a period where we're going from an aspis to much more rectangular, curved type of things. So somebody gave some thought, probably modeled again on the Gallic models, apology for the noise in the back, where the design of it is that really you're hiding your entire body profile behind this and then stabbing forward. So I feel into my reenactor role. But you see what I mean? It's a very physical form of engagement with the least of exposure. And it clearly displays several generations of pragmatics being fed into the defensive and offensive armory.
If I could add another wrinkle into the whole question of the question I'm looking at is, were there any differences in how the gladius was used in the early legions compared with later ones? How did this weapon evolve? Here's one thing I want to throw in to just confuse the issue. What if the gladius took a lot longer to become widespread in the Roman legions than we ordinarily think. That is, we're going to accept that there was more of a spear-armed Roman army going back, say prior to the Battle of the Allia and whatever that battle line that they had in the 5th century was. There's an interesting comment made by Dionysius of Halicarnassus about the Battle of Beneventum. That is in 275 BC. He makes it very clear that the Roman principes, right, that middle central line of the men in their prime, the legionaries in their prime, were armed with spears, right? So that's not the Polybian model, right? This is the model where in the Polybian model they're all armed with swords, gladii, and shields, as are the hastati, and it's only the triarii that are armed with spears. But is it possible that as late as the Pyrrhic Wars that the Roman principes were fighting with spears too? I think that the changeover that is from a predominantly spear-armed Roman army to one where it was predominantly the short sword, the gladius, however short or long you want to say the gladius was, took longer than simply saying, here's the Camillan reforms, we're all going to use swords now. So how was the gladius used in early legions? It was there.
You'd have to look at the Latin for Livy for that battle, but I thought the point that was being made is that the principes at that point used a thrusting spear instead of a pilum.
But it's still that doesn't change his point. His point,
right? It's a spear, meaning right. that is the idea that the
but
Romans
it doesn't exclude using a sword.
That's by Livy or the principes in around 340
The other question, of course, we might ask is, when we're talking about the gladius, we tend to talk about the gladius hispaniensis, which isn't even on the map yet at the time. I mean, that really is a development that apparently the Romans noticed better swords, better steel in Spain when they first came there in the Second Punic War and adopted that and improved their sword.
In that case, that's why there at least is in my mind some question as to whether or not the Roman legions of the First Punic War, 264 to 249, to 241 BC, whether or not they were using the gladius hispaniensis that early. They almost certainly had it in the Second Punic War, but it's a question of whether or not they were still using swords or spears to fight the Carthaginians prior to that. I think it's an open question. Eventually, it changed, but the thing is that I think it does support the notion that this change took longer. It was a multi-decade change, and it was not something that happened. You know what? We need a new sword. We can't fight with spears. We need swords, and it happened within a few years. I don't think it happened that way.
I think to throw another spanner into the works, unfortunately, you keep saying gladius, of course, and in terms of the Latin that's being used by our sources, it literally translates as sword, and there is examples of our sources using it in reference to possibly early examples of swords being used by Romans, which are actually more like ziphoi, the Greek style sword, and then later on, of course, some people are trying to argue, well, where exactly does there appear gradually a spatha, what we assume usually to be a cavalry sword? Spatha actually means stirrer, basically, in terms of how it stirs the air as it swipes through it. But of course, this longer sword, the spatha, then you get some of the sources referring interchangeably to spatha and gladius. And of course, that then muddies the water of, is there something in between? Are people just using gladius for just any old sword? Are they using it for gladius hispaniensis? It's really not clear.
Hey, I didn't want the conversation to go too far from what Lindsay said. I just want to draw attention to how valuable that is, right? That experimental archaeology angle. And then Mark, you talked about that armpit shot thing being a myth, right? This is one thing that has always been really, really frustrating to me, is that I understand that not every ancient warfare scholar can physically reenact combat, right? And obviously there are things about reenacting combat we can't do. We can't actually kill each other. We can't, there's a lot of the internality that can't be there. But I do think that if you're really going to answer these kinds of detailed questions, then scholars absolutely have to be willing to put on armor, pick up the weapons, and at least experience the speed and shock and ferocity and some of the internality. I really think that is a critical component. And with the rise of social media, with the rise of YouTube videos, that's becoming more socially acceptable, and you're seeing it gain more ground in scholarship. But I think it needs to be embraced much more fully. And to the point where, like, if you're getting your PhD in this field, you will have a reenactment experimental archaeology component, because there are so many questions that we really can't adequately answer unless we do the fighting. And I really think I want to sort of draw attention to the Armament Street Guard in particular, and what Lindsay was talking about as a critical component that's missing from the field in answering this very question.
It's very interesting because as an adjunct to that, the Guard actually would go to the Limes Congress, and in fact, some of these archaeologists who've studied books, and seen drawings, were absolutely astonished when they could actually feel how heavy some of the stuff was and how it was mobile, because they have an idea somehow they're like a medieval knight and they're not very flexible. And then they see it with their own eyes, and my God, that completely changes my. So I think that's a very important observation.
I had a geeky moment watching Forged in Fire, the program where the metalsmiths make their own blades. And one of the things, of course, is that someone had made a blade, and they basically, between the contests for it, stood there re-straightening it with their foot. So they were basically making the blade straight by bending it. And of course, in the Ancient Historian, I was geeking out a bit, because of course we hear the stories from Livy, I think it is, where the Gallic swords bend when they hit the Roman armor, and so the Gauls are stuck re-straightening their swords in mid-battle. I was like, it's true. So it's one of those things
that is a perfect example. And I think you guys know the story. When I went to Kinokephale, there's that question: Did Philip's phalanx lower their pikes in charge, which is what Polybius says, or did they drop them and draw their swords in charge, which is what Livy says? And so I tried running down the hill, and of course I didn't have kits, so I wasn't able to answer the question. But what I was trying to do was, like, how steep is this grade, right? Like, and what does that feel like? Now, I know that's not relevant to the Legion, but that is an example of the kind of approach that I really think, like, and that's going to take money, right? Like, we have to fund that kind of research, but I really do think the answers are there. And that example you gave with Forged in Fire is perfect. Perfect.
Next ones is we're going where, but fortunately we have a bunch of questions about centurions, which we said very little about in the issue. But Cosmo wants to know about the origin of centurions and about how seniority worked among the centurions. That one's, yeah, I think so. I have to admit, I'm not up to the history of the centurion, the early history. Who is?
Raphael D'Amato.
Well, I think we mentioned it earlier, didn't we? I think Mark mentioned it earlier when we talked about the handfuls and the century. And so there's sort of, it's connected early on with there's always one of those things about a centurion not commanding 100 men. How does that even work? No one questioned that we're in October, but it's the 10th month of the year. But anyway, that's okay. So there's that idea that we
don't start
there is an origin.
Well, I think the origin is political. Don't the Romans, when they form upon the Campus Martius for voting, don't they form in centuries? And as I understand it, this is a voting group of 100 people, and you can imagine over time when you get reforms.
The Comitia Centuriata is based on 100 on a formula of 100, but it's more complicated than 100 people.
But I think that if you're going to try and find an origin, you have to understand that the army, the militia army, is really an expression of the political
which comes
that's
first?
true.
Is it the politics that comes first, or is it the military that comes first? Because I've heard other.
Well, in Roman society, they're usually blended together.
Exactly. So, it's chicken or the egg, basically. So.
By the way, when people debate the phalanx, when people talk about,
I was just singing which came first, the chicken or the egg.
Oh.
Well, when people debate the hoplite phalanx and this idea of a hoplite revolution, which I think probably everybody on this call does not agree with, but they ask that very question: is it the the increasing socioeconomic equality that gives birth to the phalanx, or does the necessary equality of the phalanx inform the Greek assembly? I think that's an argument that's pretty well shot down, but it's the exact argument we're just having here.
But as I understand it, though, what would happen is every year the consul would call out, because they basically would, the consul have a legion each, as I understand in this period.
Yeah.
And then the subdivision of the command structure then goes down to tribunes. I presume it's just a function of battle doctrine. I can't manage this many men on my own. I need to have a deputy, and you call them a centurio because it's a centuria. So I think a lot of these things just are born out of pragmatics, and as the structure and organization evolves, some of these names, the Romans like to keep antique names for things, but the numbers change and you end up with 80s as opposed to 100. And then in terms of their primi pilis and all the other things, it's a function of where they are on the battlefield. So that the commander can say, I want number 1 and I want number 2, and the deputy and all these, this is that the pyramid style of the organization is reflected in the job titles. Gosh,
probably you're right. I mean, sorry, Stephen, but at this early time, I don't think we can say very much about how seniority worked among the centurions. And even in the later era, I believe it's still quite debated in the imperial army. Yes, we presume that, the Hastatus posterior of the 10th cohort was far outranked by the similar rank in the 2nd cohort. And the primus pullus, of course, it definitely is ahead of all the other ones, but whether it was a gradual scale from jogging through all the positions in each cohort or not.
And prior, Jasper, did you want to talk about, because before we were recording, we talked about prior versus posterior and whether or not that was.
Well, we would try and explain it. It's going to be somewhat hard to do without people having some kind of schema in front of them.
There's a prior and a posterior, right? A centurion, and there are, and it is not a settled question as to whether that has to do with rank or whether that has to do with the position of the century in the maniple. And there are schools of thought that hit it both ways. I personally find the more convincing argument is that that the centuries are positioned one behind the other, and that the prior is simply the century in front. But there are people who believe that is a rank distinction. And as an argument, and this is something I made before we started recording, we certainly know that in the Greek hoplite phalanx, which we have just disputed whether or not it existed, being closer to the front of your file, the position of promachos, the position of hegemones, at least in Macedonian phalanxes later, indicated superior status, maybe not necessarily superior rank, but you're braver, you're tougher, you go in front. And thinking that translates to whatever this prior posterior distinction is. That is an argument I've seen made, but it's not a settled issue, and I don't think the sourcing supports people having a really strong opinion either way.
Also thinking that there's a hint that the earliest Roman armies or Roman war bands or whatever being formed, if we're talking about Livy calling them legions that are serving under each of the consuls, they are basically levies that are being reformed every season. So therefore, then we'd be questioning exactly how do these ranked officers, if you like, these centurions, actually translate to, are they permanent positions or are they reappointed in, year out in terms of that early army? We just don't know.
And doesn't legion actually mean what I got here in my Latin dictionary, which I've had for about 30 years? It just means to pick. It's a levy.
It does. It is basically a levy. Or goes back to it. So again, with that sort of structure,
so the centurion is basically elected from the citizen men of that group, who then picks his optio, and it's remarkable in a sense at how democratic it sounds. But then you're talking about militia, where in almost in a Greek sense is that the people are themselves the army. They're defending their homeland, and therefore they want to trust the people who are going to lead them to war.
One interesting point, and I have no sourcing to base this, but in a society that is so conscious of wealth-based status, this idea of a military rank, existing in the air divorced from that, especially Lindsay, when you talk about coming together and the leader coming forward, the richest, most powerful person in that particular area who's raising the unit, like that's your guy, right? Like the idea, like that, especially when you have wealth-based armies that are supplying their own stuff. I certainly think that that's probably a factor in who's in charge and who has higher status, like whether who's going to be.
It worked that way in the 18th century very often, certainly with militias. You want to raise a regiment? Okay, you pay for it. You're the colonel now. Bing.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think it combines with a certain element of situational leadership as well.
Well, even the American Civil War, I think.
Yeah.
That happened as late as the 1860s with the Union Army.
Lindsay, you got cut off there. Could you?
Yeah, so I think all those things combined with, yes, you can have the rich guy that's got, again, we can tie it in with a client patron situation, or the guy's got more panoply and therefore looks more impressive. But to win wars, you need to have people who are good at fighting. And you need people who have natural or somehow learned leadership skills. So at that point, you're given more flexibility as to who will actually be on the front lines executing your orders. So I think in that way, the Roman class system doesn't have to be so much in the way, because at that point, you're all soldiers in the army, and the job is to defend the Respublica or whatever it is.
That's true, but the Roman army, it's also a self-reinforcing system, because you win the war, the higher rank gets paid more. So the odds that the centurion of last year is going to be the richest guy in the neighborhood next year.
Well, I wonder, because again, I don't know how pay is done in the. We're talking the 6th century. Are we talking, Rabbi?
Yeah, but we've seen there's several examples of how after Libya has a couple examples, I think, of after a battle or after a war, how the loot is divided, and that's by rank.
Apparently, the Roman army, the Roman legionaries, were not actually paid for their service until the last decade of the 5th century. It was sometime they say it was the siege of Veii. So, and it was only more or less spending money. It was not you call it like an actual salary. It was money to buy food and things like that. That is still service was meant to be something that you did, on your own. Your own resources, so which is why wealth mattered so much.
So as the composition of the army in terms of its actual membership changes every year, because it's effectively disbanded at the end of the campaign, the new consuls come in and they pick a whole new bunch of guys. So some men will probably find themselves season to season because they're just very good, and other people will be, no, we don't need you, like being picked in a school football team. Can you imagine I wasn't always the best pick, but the point is, I think what you end up is that the elites tend to choose the best people to go fight the wars, and they get rewarded through the spoils and the payments. So in a sense, there's a virtue to the way this thing works.
The interesting consideration there is also that we don't hear as much about the Latin allies, and as Rome sort of comes to dominate Italy. And if there is sort of a hint, if we go with the idea of a lot of these early commanders being basically the heads of clans, and of course some of them, if we take the Claudii as an example, who of course are late migrants into the Roman aristocracy, they are bringing connections with them from other parts of Italy. So of course, if they're picking their own, picking a new army every year, in terms of the allies, and of course the allies always equal or outnumber a lot of the time the Roman legionaries themselves. What is the connection between the allies that are available and the leader that is actually put in charge? I mean, I think that's going to be a significant point in terms of the leader and the composition. It is that personal connection that actually comes through.
I think this is interesting. In the Roman world, in the ancient world, personal connections matter very much. So the people who advance are the ones who have the best networks.
Speaking of networks, Abram on Patreon asks, before the Roman road system, what kind of terrain or paths did the early Romans have to traverse?
I'd like
that was a very corny segue there.
No idea.
Yeah, I had to do something.
That's my answer. I do not know.
Well, the simple answer is, the first wars were fought very nearby, so logistics and road systems were not very much of a feature yet. but otherwise, that's not my thing either.
I think the main one that always gets trotted out is the Via Appia is one of the earliest roads that's constructed by the military for military purposes, and that is in 312 BC by Appius Claudius. And of course, but whether it's actually reaffirming something. I mean, I think we sort of talked earlier about if you look at the Roman roads in Britain, and I know this is going to throw up some argument. Some of those are based on pre-existing Celtic and prehistoric roads, and not roads but pathways that are already in existence that are basically just improved by the Romans. So whether that was the case in Italy or whether they were establishing these new military roads for particular purposes, I don't think we've got a real clear idea of.
But again, it's the topology of the country is going to actually influence these things. So, you go through a valley because you don't want to crawl over the top of it. And so that forms a natural pathway. Rivers are another way. In fact, years ago, I remember going to a presentation in Caerleon where the professor, I think it's Mark Halsall, made the point that if you want to understand the Roman invasion of Wales, follow the railways. And he made it very interesting because railway engineers actually will find the best compromise between geography and the cost of laying the track.
Actually, Lindsay, if I can interrupt, that's just brought to mind something that was mentioned at a conference just 2 years ago. I understand that there's been a whole bunch of research, of course, in terms of roads in Britain, Roman roads in Britain in the last couple of years. Basically, a group, I can't remember which university it was, basically looked at the existing map of Roman roads in Britain and basically said, isn't it funny how there's none in Cornwall? Or very little, and of course that they set off looking for, surely we're missing something down there. And what they actually found was they'd been missed because a lot of the Roman roads in Cornwall actually were basically taken over by the railways, and basically then that was the obvious route, so that's what they used, etc. So just
So I just think some of these things are in kind of I'm not going to say instinctual, but the common sense applications. I'm not going to build the most inefficient way. I want the most efficient way. And in fact, I saw something recently where they were trying to apply artificial intelligence, and they got the machine, and the machine was doing exactly these things. It was looking for nodes within the network which represented the fastest means to get from point A to point B. And sometimes it does mean drilling a tunnel, and sometimes it means going over the top, but you'll do it maybe a zigzag because you've got to get a bunch of men who are carrying heavy equipment, and the way they'll do that best is a series of lower incline ascents as opposed to a big steep. So some of these things are just simply a function of topology and geography.
So there's a professor at the Citadel, Michael Livingston. He writes frequently for Medieval Warfare magazine. He and I have co-authored a bunch of articles for Ancient Warfare, and he has a axiom which supports both of what you're saying, which is men flow like water, right? So if you picture water flowing over a landscape, what's it going to do? It's going to go to the lowest path, the path of least resistance, the quickest and lowest route, easiest route to wherever it's going. And I think it's a really good mental rule to keep in mind when you don't have sufficient data and you're trying to figure out routes of march.
So, for example, the simplest observation I could say, you're walking along a path and you'll suddenly find there's a grassy area with a whole series of patches because people have found the shortest way, and it's not what the town planner thought.
Right.
Final question, because we're already in an hour. Were there regional differences between legions, both in army composition and tactics favored? Here's supposition department for the last 5 minutes.
Yeah, this is tough.
In what period? Specifically in this early period? Or
we're talking about the very early period, in which case it should be clear by now that we have to say do no.
Well, effectively, in the
later
earliest
Republic,
period, we've
might
got
be able to
only
say something.
4 legions to start with, if we go with what Livy's telling us in terms of the levy originally, and they are 4 legions and being divided between the 2 consuls, and so they're being reformed every year, but they don't seem to be unless they're being picked for a particular reason by the particular consul, it's not really clear.
I suspect you don't get to see any of those kinds of variations until the Roman army is on these very long extended campaigns, for example, in the Iberian Peninsula, which go on for presumably decades, where, the local deployed troops are going to pick up equipment from the other side, or they're going to see that works better than mine, I'm going to copy it. and therefore you might say, well, you might get maybe some Iberian influence, Celto-Iberian influence, which the truth back in mainland Italy wouldn't see. Hence the
only
Espaniensis.
The only
Exactly,
supposition I was going to add to it was exactly that. That I think it would depend on where the units were raised, and I think it would depend on their dependence on the ale that were attached to them. Right? Those things bring cultural, I don't know, influence to bear on that may create a distinctly generic character. But the truth is, we are just guessing. That's a guess.
It would be interesting to know if there were consuls who requested specific allies for specific abilities.
Well, my guess would be
that
pragmatics, right? You want to win, so you pick the best team.
And we certainly know, like in the later Roman army, certainly specific ethnic groupings are attached to. And Lindsay, don't beat me up if I'm speaking out of turn here, but like a German guard, right? Like, there's an idea that a certain ethno-linguistic group brings a specific combat role. But there's certainly later we see that, right? Or at least the idea of that. But I don't know if that exists at this time. Lindsay, did I mess that up?
No. We got consent also from Jasper. I think the difficulty is that if we're talking like what was it, the 5th and early centuries, we don't know. But we certainly know for the 3rd century and beyond, and certainly by the time you get to Augustus, absolutely.
And that note, I was going to say shockwave, but it hardly is because we've been there before, I think. I'd like to thank you all for your contributions, and we'll speak again very soon.
Thanks
Bye.
for having us.